Well, welcome everyone to this open group webinar, which today is being brought to us by our partners and members at Avolution Software. Before I hand over to our speaker, Grant Quick, today, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping issues to keep the event moving forward smoothly. Firstly, with regards to questions, if you'd like to ask Grant a question, the best way to do that is to write your question into the text QA facility. If you do write a question in there, can I ask you to address it to all participants? That way everyone gets to see all the questions that have been submitted. And our plan is to try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of Grant's presentation today. Now, if for any reason you have to leave this presentation today early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, then today's presentation is being recorded. So everyone who has registered will get an email with a link to that recording, so that we'll be able to see that tomorrow. So Grant, if you're ready, can I ask you to start today's presentation?
Perfect. Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for attending today. Before I jump in, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Simon and the Open Group because, as you probably know, a lot of them are based in London, and so facilitating this at 2 AM in their time is a huge help to us, so we really appreciate their support in the Asia Pacific region. Now, my name's Grant Quick, and I am with Avolution. We are the makers of the ABACUS toolset, but today we'll be talking about road mapping with TOGAF and ArchiMate Plus. So what the plus means in this case is that TOGAF and ArchiMate provide some guidance on road mapping, but it's not fully conclusive, so we'll be building on what they offer and looking at potentially other frameworks as well, so you can understand how road mapping could be applied practically in your organization and some of the best practice ideas that are out there today. So the basic agenda will be that we'll be looking at why we undertake road mapping and what the benefits are. We'll then look at building the foundations of road mapping and how you can get ready for it. Then we'll look at the different techniques for building roadmaps, and there's 4 different types of roadmaps that we'll talk about today. We'll then look at how you can demonstrate the value of roadmaps to various different stakeholders, how you can manage the delivery to them, and finally at the end we'll be looking at any questions that you have along the way and see how we can best answer those. So I won't spend too long here, but just to give you a little bit of background about who I am and where I come from. So I'm with Avolution, and we've been around for about 17 years now. We're a spin-off company from the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, and so I'm based in Sydney, not too far down the road from where that is. And we've grown quite significantly over the past few years. We have reached out to over 100 countries now and cover about 2,000 different companies. We do support clients in virtually all the major industries, from finance down through to healthcare. We've got 6 global offices, including this office in Sydney. And we work with a large network of partners as well, including the Open Group. As regards to myself, I am the CTO with Avolution. Some of you may know me. I worked in America previously and did a lot in consulting over there. Also done some work in application development, but now as the CTO, I'm more focused on technologies and navigating our course through the future. So road mapping is something that I work with quite a lot. So let's start by looking at why you might road map. And before we get stuck too far into that, let's look at what the definition of a roadmap is. When you look at definitions of roadmaps, there's really no 2 definitions that line up perfectly. Everybody has their own spin on what it means exactly. But the TOGAF definition is very good. It's very solid, and you can find that in the definitions section of TOGAF in section 3. And it says that a roadmap is an abstracted plan for business or technology change, typically operating across multiple disciplines over multiple years, normally used in the phrases technology roadmap, architecture roadmap, etc. So I've highlighted a few things here which typically you'll find in most definitions of road mapping. Firstly, it is a plan. If you think about a roadmap, you'll often think about going on holidays and getting from one point to another point, and that's essentially what it is, except it's for business. So it's a plan on how you get from point A to point B, and it looks at change. So obviously to get from where you are today to where you want to be, that's going to involve some kind of change. And then the third aspect that we've highlighted here is that it's, in this case, over multiple years. Now that's typical, but in all cases it involves some aspect of time. So whether it's years, months, or decades, it's always going to involve change happening over a period of time and having a plan to do that. So road mapping currently is the hottest topic that we see in terms of questions that come our way from different clients and prospects that we work with. We've created a Wordle over here at the side, which shows the most frequently requested terms, and you'll see that roadmap is by far and away the largest one there at the moment. So why is that the case, and what is the benefit of road mapping? Why do people want to look at road mapping? And ultimately it comes down to needing a direction. Enterprise architecture at its core is about providing a direction and helping decision making, so road mapping fits perfectly into that. It also comes about because conventional planning is somewhat limited. Most organizations are very effective at doing project plans and making sure that projects take place within budgets, within times, and so forth. But that doesn't always fit into the larger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve. It's very tactical, and it isn't necessarily involved in strategy. So oftentimes projects are run in silos, there's interdependencies that people don't understand. One project might impact another, it might make another project somewhat obsolete. And if you're not doing a higher level planning, then obviously there's going to be some issues with that, or at least some inefficiencies. Road mapping is about predicting what is predictable. Obviously there's always going to be things that can't be predicted, but road mapping is really about taking risk away so that you can predict what might pop up in the future and how you might be able to most effectively navigate around that. If we look at the different missions for why people want to do road mapping, it can be things such as managing cost and efficiency, so making sure that projects are going to give you the best bang for buck and not get in each other's way. It can be about responding to customer needs and making sure that the initiatives that you have are going to address the capabilities that you'll need to address those needs. It's also about managing risks, as I mentioned, and security threats and things of that nature. Oftentimes it's about addressing compliance, and many of you will be familiar with recent regulations with GDPR, and of course you'll be familiar with the waves that that's causing in a lot of organizations that deal with Europe. And so roadmaps can help us to plan around what needs to be done to make sure that such compliances are addressed. It's about planning and managing IT service effectively, and of course it can be very useful when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. If you have roadmaps in place, it's easier to see where you've been going and how that might correlate with the vision of the other company that you're merging with. So once you've decided that you'd like to roadmap, then you need to look at the foundations that are needed for road mapping. It's something that does require a fair bit of data, and so it requires a level of maturity that not all organizations are at. It doesn't mean that you can't build roadmaps, it just means that you're limited in the kinds of roadmaps that you can build. So we'll look at what foundations are needed, and let's start by looking at what is in a roadmap. So as I mentioned, it needs to have a starting point. You need to be able to know where you are today before you can figure out how you're going to get to where you want to be. And of course, where you want to be is a very key part of that roadmap. One of the most overlooked aspects of road mapping is why. So you'll often see managers coming in with roadmaps and saying, well, here's our roadmap for the next 5 years. Read it, understand it. But ultimately, if they're not explaining why they're doing this, then it's hard for business managers to be able to justify the investment in those plans. So it's always fundamental that you start with why. When you're providing executive summaries around roadmaps and things of that nature, always start with why to make sure that the intent is clearly understood. And then, of course, you need to address the change and how that's occurring. So we need to look at how we're going to get from point A to point B. It might be in one fell swoop, or there might be different stages along the way. in which case we might be looking at different transition architectures that will help us get from our current state architecture to our future state architecture. So in terms of building up the foundations that are needed for that, one of the biggest accelerators is to use standards. And of course, I think everyone here likes standards. That's why we're here with the open group today. And of course, standards provide a lot of useful things, such as pre-configured assets in terms of reference models and things of that nature. So you can reuse ontologies that have been well thought out, and you can build on them yourselves rather than having to create them from scratch. You can look at ways that the standards provide information on how you shape your roadmaps, and we'll be looking at that today. You can also use metamodels, and so both TOGAF and ArchiMate have metamodels that can be used and customized if needed, and they do provide a lot of the key elements that are important for road mapping. And of course, they provide templates and notations, so it helps to make sure that things are modeled consistently and people understand exactly what they're looking at. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about ABACUS today, but it's worth pointing out that ABACUS is certified for TOGAF 9.2 as well as ArchiMate 3. So we have a library for both of those as well as many other frameworks. But ultimately, when you look at tooling, it's important to consider the kinds of standards that are being supported, I should say, and make sure that they're out of the box and not things that are going to be additional gotchas you've got to pay for down the track. So if we look at TOGAF 9.2, it provides not a lot of guidance specifically around the term road mapping. You've got your definition. There is also a section in phase E that talks a little bit about road mapping, but it's certainly not a whole chapter or anything to that extent. But essentially, the road mapping that occurs with TOGAF's recommended methodology is primarily in phase E. Now, you will start to look at roadmaps as you look at phases B, C, and D, so the business, information, and technology architectures. That's where you're going to be building your candidate architecture roadmap components. And so once you've built those and you get to phase E, it's about putting together your first phase of or your first draft, I should say, of the roadmap that you have as an architectural roadmap. And that's really about doing gap analysis and understanding those various candidates and prioritizing them accordingly. And that roadmap's going to be refined as you get into the migration planning phase. Road mapping really leads into the implementation and migration plan, which is essentially a more detailed plan that involves activities. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the ADM in TOGAF is iterative, so it's not something you're just going to do sequentially and then forget about. A roadmap is a living, breathing document that will be changed, or I should say a set of documents and artifacts that will change over time, and so they will change as your organization and its architecture changes. Now, if we look at ArchiMate, it doesn't really refer specifically to road mapping. In fact, the standard only uses the word roadmap once, and it's in the example. But if you look at the meta model itself, there are some things in there that are very specific to road mapping, especially when you look at plateaus, which represent states in time, and gaps, which are the functional deficiencies between plateaus, essentially. So those are the key elements that you'll be using when you build roadmaps if you're using ArchiMate. And the structure there is a really good guide for some of the visualizations that you might consider. Now, if we look at building a repository for producing road mapping, of course, that needs to be built off an enterprise architecture repository. And if we look at this picture here in the middle, we're looking at something that comes from the open group that you might be familiar with. And so a repository is made up of, firstly, having a meta model on which you can structure your content, and then also the architecture landscape itself, where you've got your artifacts, your reference libraries, standards coming in from other places. And so if we look at what that means in practice, you can look at using TOGAF and ArchiMate in your meta model. It doesn't hurt to look at other standards as well. You can mix and match. In fact, we do have our own ABACUS meta model, which is basically a best of breeds approach, incorporating a lot of best practices. But TOGAF and ArchiMate are great starting points If you want to look at things like strategic modelling, you might look at OMG's business motivation model and other things of that nature to make sure that you've got sufficient depth in those areas. In terms of the landscape, you can look at different kinds of artifacts. So architecture is not just about building diagrams. You can look at catalogues and lists of information that you have, matrices focusing on interdependencies and connectiveness. You might look at charts such as pie charts and bar charts, which are things that might appeal to stakeholders outside of the core EA group. And then you might look at some other standards as well. Over in the top right there, we're looking at things that can be used as reference models. So APQC is a very common example, but if you're in a specific industry like banking, you might use BIAN. So that will help you to build a capability model. And then you can also look at other things such as where you might have information available to you externally. So things like the Technopedia catalog from Flexera. It provides a lot of standard information, things like lists of retirement dates and other life cycle dates that are important to different software and hardware technologies that come from vendors. And maybe if you're using things like AWS for hosting, you can look at leveraging the information that you get from there as well. Now, if we look at building that, a lot of people will ask, well, look, can I start doing it in Microsoft Office? And you certainly can if you're a small team, maybe just 1 or 2 people, and you don't have anything in your belt at the moment, then certainly Microsoft Office is as good as any starting point. But you will grow out of that very quickly, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that data doesn't get centralized, so you have to look at maintaining lots of different artifacts, and they'll become very quickly inconsistent. It's very difficult to communicate what you have in Excel because ultimately people have to read the sheets or maybe some of the charts, but you are limited in terms of not being able to produce reports or produce executive dashboards that different stakeholders will like to see. And of course, there's no meta model or framework that you can enforce using things like Excel and Visio. So it's very easy for inconsistency to jump in from that area too. So because road mapping does require a certain level of maturity, it is important to get your tooling correct from the get-go and very early in the process. So it's important to evaluate tools that you can use, make sure that the tools are fit for purpose. Now, in terms of getting data, we talked a bit about standards that you can bring in, but in terms of the actual data itself, you do need to get a lot of it to be able to produce certain roadmaps. And ultimately, if you put the burden of that on the EA team, it can become a job just in and of itself. And ultimately, if you're focused on that, you don't have enough time to be strategically planning. So the best thing to do is to try and leverage as much information in your organization that you already have. You might already have Excel documents and Visio diagrams that you can import into your EA repository. You might have things like ServiceNow or other CMDBs where you can leverage information. And the other thing you can look at is also leveraging other departments in your organization. So are they willing to help keep certain inventories up to date? If you stick something complicated in front of them, they may not be, but you might be able to produce something simple, like if your tool supports a nice friendly web front end where they can import information directly and update lists, or maybe if they can use SharePoint or something like that, where they don't have to learn a lot of new skills. It's simply about updating information. And ultimately, if you can also produce something of value for them, then they'll see the value of actually going in and updating that data for you. So those are our foundations. When we get to building roadmaps, what does it actually mean? The best guidance in TOGAF really comes from section 12 around phase E. So there is a small section there around what is involved in a roadmap. It's section 12.3.11. And what it talks about is basically a roadmap being a package of assets and the kinds of things that that can entail. So it doesn't give specifics about how those are produced, but it does give you a good framework to work from. So essentially a roadmap involves having a list of work packages, activities that need to be performed to help you achieve the change that you need. It can also look at things like context diagrams. So what are the impacts and dependencies between different parts of the roadmap? So you might show that as a matrix or as a diagram. Ultimately, looking at change also involves looking at gaps and solutions that address those gaps. And a great way of looking at that is often with a bubble chart. So there's an example over there at the right that's showing the risk versus value of different projects. So basically the things that should be addressed first typically will be the ones in the upper right-hand quadrant. We can look at color coding the status of those things so we can understand what our recommendations might be. It also involves looking at transition architectures. So those are the plateaus that we just talked about in ArchiMate. With transition architectures, you're basically looking at a future state that's not the ultimate state, so somewhere in between that will help you to get there. And using date properties on those transition architectures is one of the keys to making them really useful and to be able to produce a lot of the visualizations that are going to talk to various different stakeholders. And of course, the implementation recommendations that go with all of that. Now back to ArchiMate, just expanding on what we talked about there. We talked about the plateaus and the gaps between them. So the plateaus are the three green boxes. They're on the lower level of green boxes, the baseline architecture, transition architecture, and target architecture that you see there. So those represent various points in time, and the gaps between them are shown above that in the more wavy looking box. And then down below that, we're attaching various other components. So we've actually got some application components in the blue boxes. So it's showing the applications that are involved in those various transition architectures. So some of those applications come in during the transition architecture. One of the application components doesn't get implemented until the target architecture. And then down the bottom, we're looking at the actual work packages and the deliverables that are involved with those. So we can see how those are associated with those different states in time. So you can see how building a diagram like that can be useful to communicate changes over time that relate to a roadmap. Now, if you use either of those frameworks or both, you don't have to be restricted to just those kinds of artifacts. Really, it's up to your imagination as to where you go with road mapping. And a lot of different charts that business stakeholders are more familiar with are going to be of great value. So if you look at things like tree maps, they can look at how things are broken down in terms of perhaps cost or maybe risk. They might like to look at line charts where they can see change over time. So how does our expenditure go down over time? How does risk go down? And so you can look at measuring those things and displaying those on charts. Or of course, you might push together reports and dashboard views that bring all of these visualizations together into one place where people can understand them and make use of them quickly. Now, in terms of the actual visualizations that you build, we've worked with a lot of clients and seen a lot of different kinds, but ultimately we find that they boil down into three different types, and I'll talk about those in more detail. But type 1 looks at tagging and recommendation with heat maps and other techniques. Type 2 is when you start to look at lifecycle charts and Gantt charts. Type 3 is where we look at work package impacts and interdependencies. And type 4 is where we start to look at multiple architectures. And that's really where you start to look at what TOGAF refers to as candidates. So we're looking at different possibilities for the future. And we can start to measure them and analyze them and understand which ones are going to give us the best path forward so that we can make our recommendations to senior managers who need to sign off on these strategies. So let's start with the type 1 roadmap, the recommendations and heat maps. And oftentimes a really good place to start with this is when you look at capability mapping. So over on the right here, you can see a capability map showing our business capabilities broken up into different areas. And the same diagram is shown below, but it's showing some heat mapping. So essentially we're tagging our strategic intent, our recommendation for what we're going to be doing with these various capabilities, And that might be derived from other areas. We might look at the projects and which things they're going to be impacting as we get further into road mapping. But initially, it might even just be what we know today. So what's going on in our organization? We don't necessarily have to be making recommendations just yet. We can look at what is happening, and then we can take that a step further and start to measure things and look at what our recommendation would be as opposed to what's going on today. But being able to show that with a color-coded chart like that is a really good way to represent things to many different audiences. It really helps to bring a lot of diagrams to life that otherwise wouldn't tell much of a story. And so that's a really good place to start with your road mapping. Now, there's other ways of showing a type 1 roadmap. One would be with bubble charts like we looked at before. Now, those will typically have a quadrant approach where you can look at things that are in positive territory, falling into the upper right quadrant, and those are the things that are strong performers, and things down the bottom left not so much. So there are a few methodologies out there you can use to help with that. One of them is the time methodology, where you've got tolerate, invest, migrate, and eliminate based on where things fall in the quadrants. There's also the 4 R's. Those are retain, redesign, refresh, and retire. Basically the same thing, but just different terminology. Or you might use your own terminology, things that are just more common to understand, more intuitive. So things like replace or invest, mainstream, contain. So it's up to you how you define those things, but ultimately the concept is the same. Tag things based off what your recommendation is going to be. You can then start to look at measuring things with, say, business fit and technical fit. You might base those off reliability and cost, or things like technical debt and maintainability on the technical side, essentially how well things apply or comply with your standards. And so that's what we're showing in this particular heat map over to the right with this bubble chart, I should say. We've got business fit up the left-hand y-axis and technical fit across the x-axis. And so we can see that things that are strong performers in both will fall in the upper right quadrant. So that's where we're going to retain and invest. You might also show things like sunbursts and other kinds of matrix views to help categorize things. Ultimately, it's up to you. Whatever your stakeholders need to see can be presented in a format that's going to be friendly to them. Now, one thing I haven't addressed yet is that we haven't shown any time here. So that's the one thing we talked about earlier, being one of the common things that you'll see in roadmap definitions. They involve time. But the first step of road mapping doesn't even need to involve time. It can just be, where do we want to get to and what kind of things can we do to get there. We can figure out the time as we start to mature our practice. Now, we don't have to be restricted just to flat charts and diagrams. You can also have interactive heat maps. And so here we've got things like tree maps that you can drill into. So you might be looking at different geographical regions, and you might be interested in one in particular. So you can drill into that and see its various applications or other things that might be earmarked for recommendations. Or you might present it in other forms like sunburst diagrams, which are essentially just pie charts that you can drill into. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it interactively and make it an experience that users can interact with and understand better. Now, if we get to the type 2 roadmaps, that's where we do start to introduce the element of time. We can look at when things are happening, timescales, dependencies, and activities. We talk a lot about Gantt charts being the things that are shown. Technically, a Gantt chart is a project management term, so more technically speaking, life cycle charts is probably a better term, but ultimately a bar chart with different milestones and things of that nature shown. So whether you call it a Gantt chart or a life cycle chart doesn't really matter, but ultimately that's the most common kind of artifact that people think about when it comes to road mapping. And so it is an important thing to consider, which stakeholders want to see those kinds of views. And then we can look at bridging the two together. So we can look at using that heat mapping we had from the first phase and overlaying it with these type 2 roadmaps. Something to keep in mind with life cycles, it's not just about capabilities or about applications. Every component that you have in your architecture is a candidate for life cycle. in some of our own metamodels, we look at applying life cycles to all the different components. Everything essentially, including the organization itself, has a life cycle. It goes through different phases. And so they might involve things like product launches and decommissionings, or it might be things that are external to you. So you need to include things that are both internal and external. At a minimum, life cycles typically involve a start and an end, a from date and a to date. And then you can look at other milestones along the way that might be important to you. And in fact, TOGAF itself does have property recommendations in its content meta model, and that includes initial live date, date of last release, date of next release, and retirement date. Now, once you start to look at those timings, certain dependencies come into play that you can start to analyze. So you might look at which applications are replacing other applications. And when we look at those, we want to make sure that the applications that are going to be taking over are in production before we decommission the old ones. Otherwise, we can go ahead and create ourselves a nasty gap in the architecture that we're going to have to come back and reduce very quickly, or not reduce, but rather fix very quickly. So understanding those basic dependencies between times is very important, understanding the timing mismatches, and just being able to see a Gantt chart or a lifecycle chart can be a big help in being able to do that. Lifecycles, of course, can go across layers if we are looking at multiple components. So you don't have to show them all separately. You can show a multi-dimensional roadmap. So in this example here, we're showing applications, technologies, infrastructure, and their impacts on other areas. And so you can start to look at the life cycle on those various components and see how they interrelate. Ultimately, enterprise architecture is a holistic practice. You're looking at a larger ecosystem. So it's important that you do look at other things beyond just the basic components that would typically be modeled. Now, as we get into dependencies, we can start to tie those to work packages, and that's where we start to look at what we call a type 3 roadmap. So life cycles are telling you when things are happening, but they're not telling you how. So they don't really tell you what dependencies are needed in terms of having to prioritize projects and things like that. And so we need to start looking at work packages and activities to understand the actions that need to take place, and what the impacts on those actions will be by making changes in other areas. So coming back, that ArchiMate example that we looked at is a great example of looking at a type 3 roadmap and understanding those impacts. So we can start to look at those applications, for example, that we have there. They might be involved in other work packages and states as well, plateaus, and so we can start to understand if there are impacts, what the flow-on effect from that might be. You might look at calculating dates and times based off the flow-on effect. So if you make a certain change in one area, what's the flow-on effect going to be to other work packages? Is that going to introduce delays, or is that going to introduce new time constraints where that has to be completed quicker? Those are the kinds of things that we can identify by looking at a type 3 roadmap. So in addition to looking at a diagram, a matrix is a great view for looking at dependencies. A matrix essentially involves looking at two components, one across the x-axis, one across the y, and then looking at how those things are interrelated in the cells where they join up. And then the most mature kind of roadmap that we look at is the multiple architectures roadmap. So to look at multiple architectures, you have to have a pretty good handle on your as-is architecture, and you need to be able to start looking at candidates for the future. So that's where we start to look at our staging architectures and our future state architectures that we might like to achieve, and then making sure that our transition architectures give us a way to step across the stepping stones and get to the future state that we have in mind. So TOGAF, of course, talks about baselines, targets, and transitions. There's other words you'll hear for those, as is, to be, and so forth. Ultimately, the migrations between architectures are modeled using properties, components, and connections. And so, so far we've looked at that in the sense of one architecture, but when we get to a type 4 roadmap, we really start to split out our architectures separately so that we can compare and contrast them, and understand why, the fundamental question of why it is important that we might prioritize one work package over another, and why we might choose to go with one future state as our strategy. If we look at multiple architectures across the various different scenarios that we have, you might start with your as-is architecture. I think the diagrams over to the right here tell a really good story. So if you look at the red line that we've got there in the middle of that, we have our as-is architecture as it is today. You might compare that also to previous states that you have. So you could look at where things were a year previously or 5 years previously and see where we've come in that time. And then we might look at different scenarios or candidates for where we would like to be in the future. So scenario 1 that we have might be more geared towards higher performance. It'll have improvements in availability, but not as much as the other scenarios. Scenario 3 at the other extreme has very high availability, but performance hasn't improved as much. If we look at scenario 2, it's a balance in the middle. And so it might not be the most exciting, but if we then factor in other things like cost, we might find that it's the most cost-effective solution that we have. So maybe that's the selected scenario that we'll go with. If we look down at the bottom visualization, this is really getting to where a roadmap exists in a type 4 scenario. So we're looking at not just where we want to go, but how. And so we've got our current state will be the very far left of that one. The future 2B state is at the very far right. And we're looking at 2 different paths that allow us to get us there. So there's basically lots of different transition architectures that we can look at addressing. Some will give us certain benefits earlier than others. So ultimately the end state is the same, but taking certain transitions might give us short-term benefits that we wouldn't get if we took a different path. So it's important to analyze those paths and be able to understand what the best one is to take forward to get to where you want to go. So when we look at demonstrating value and presenting these kinds of roadmaps to various audiences, one of the key things, as I've mentioned, is really to understand why we are doing these things and make sure that that's communicated. Oftentimes as architects, we know why we're doing things, but we forget that that's not obvious to the other audiences that we're communicating with. So it's important that that's spelled out and made clear very early. A lot of senior managers won't really entertain ideas until they understand why you want to do them. So it's important that you start with that, but then also look at what is happening, when it's happening, and how it's happening. So you need to include all of those factors, and that's essentially what those types of roadmaps that we talked about do. The type 1 communicates what, the type 2 communicates when, type 3 communicates how, and then to understand why we need to look at addressing those type 4 roadmaps. So show the current state, the future state, what you're trying to achieve being the objectives, that's the why, and the roadmap being the how of how you're going to get between those 2 states. A great way of starting is to look at capability-based planning. So as I mentioned, you could use a lot of the different ontologies that are available to you today, things like APQC and BIAN or ETOM in the telco industry. And you can take these ontologies and build out business capability frameworks. You might use them as they are, or you might tailor them to your organization. And it gives a great top-down view of where you're going to be going. So we looked at that business capability heat map before. That's really telling us where we're going based purely on a capability model that we have. And so for corporate stakeholders, this is a really important view because that's how they tend to view the organization rather than in a technical sense where they might be looking at the physical components that they have and how they work together to deliver value. And ultimately, what we need to be able to do is measure these capabilities and measure the change and show empirically how we can improve these capabilities and what the vector is going to be. But then the key question is, how do we measure that? So when we look at measuring architectures and scenarios, what we can do is look at a lot of the non-functional things. So if you're familiar with software development, of course, you'll look at non-functional requirements, and you know all the things that we end with ility or ility, ity or ility. And so those are things like reliability, agility, complexity, and so forth. But of course, the number one bottom line that always comes up in corporate meetings is cost. So you can look at CapEx or OpEx or the total cost of ownership for various different decisions. You might also look at things like performance and scalability. So these are the kinds of measures that help you to justify going in one direction as opposed to another. And algorithms can be used to help calculate or simulate these things. So rather than just taking a guess and saying, well, I think this is going to be good value because it's got some cheap applications in it and the ones we buy currently are not so cheap, well, it might also involve a lot of cost in terms of training or consulting. So it's important to be able to understand the big picture and be able to calculate these things in a way that's going to give you some more accuracy and less bias. Once you've done these calculations and understood what the outputs are from these algorithms, you can look at then charting those into various charts that are going to make sense to the audiences that you're addressing. We then look at managing roadmap delivery, how we get it out there, and how we actually go about doing our roadmaps. And the most important thing that I really can't stress enough is to make sure that you break it down to a level that's achievable. So do just enough road mapping. Don't worry about trying to roadmap the entire organization all in one foul swoop. Break things up. Many of you are probably familiar with the analogy of the blind men touching the elephant, and the first one feels the trunk and says, well, it feels like a hose, and the last one feels the tail and it feels like a tassel or whatever it feels like to them. And so a lot of different audiences have a different viewpoint of what it is that you have in an architecture. And so you might look at partitioning up your architecture to address those viewpoints so that you can understand them and communicate them to those stakeholders before trying to address everybody's needs. And so being able to make sure you select different partitions that are going to give you value and provide some understanding to key stakeholders is really one of the key things to do before you do get too far into your road mapping activities. TOGAF does provide some guidance on how to break things down in terms of partitions. So if we look at that, we can look at strategic, segment, and capability architectures. So we've got a diagram here that shows that, which comes from the open group. Essentially, there's 4 different dimensions that you can break partitions up to. So we can look at the breadth of what we have. We can look at the level or the depth that we have as well. We can look at time or our planning horizon. And then we can also look at how recent things are and how frequently they get refreshed. So we can pick out these pieces and make sure that they address the stakeholders that we need to talk to initially, so that we can deliver value that's going to be important to them, and make sure that we get buy-in to our enterprise architecture practice and the road mapping activities that we do with that. So I'll wrap up shortly and we'll get into some Q&A so we can look at the questions that have come in and how we can best answer those for you. But the takeaways I wanted to give you today is that it's important to have a platform on which you build your road mapping practice. Make sure you understand what it is you're trying to do with road mapping and build a platform around that. Make sure that you accelerate what you're doing with road mapping by using standards. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Use what you have in front of you, build on the shoulders of giants. Make sure that you adjust your presentation style to your stakeholders. Don't present box and line diagrams to audiences that won't understand what they are. Use them for audiences that will. Also, demonstrate business value using capabilities, because that is going to be something that makes sense to a lot of senior stakeholders, and make sure that it's something that they can relate to. And finally, as we just discussed, make sure that you partition the delivery of your roadmap up in a way that's going to be achievable and not take you 5 years to produce, so that you can get value out of it sooner and make sure that stakeholders are satisfied. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left, and those were the key topics that I wanted to discuss today. As Simon mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions, please do pop them into the chat window, and I'll be able to address those as they come through.
That's brilliant, Grant. Thank you very much for that. A couple of questions I just wanted to go through while people write in there. First of all, a question from Dennis, Grant. Dennis says, also, roadmaps need to align with strategic intent of the organization. Sometimes there is no top-down strategies. What will be the approach in such situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So taking a bit of a step back, a lot of people ask us, well, how should I model my organization in terms of enterprise architecture? Should I go top-down? Should I go bottom-up? Certain organizations and bodies have their recommendations. Typically, they prefer top-down. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter when you're getting started with EA, whether you go top-down or bottom-up. If you have a lot of artifacts available to you that are more at the bottom levels, you can start with those and then build up from there. But ultimately, when you do get to road mapping, it is important that you communicate the strategic intent. So you do need to make sure that you've got your strategic model pretty well sorted out so that you can relate back to that. I mentioned business motivation model as a really good standard to help build out on that. Both ArchiMate and TOGAF provide some guidance on strategy, but business motivation model is in fact recommended in TOGAF, and it's a great place to extend out to go into more detail. So as you go through the roadmaps, especially as you get to type 3, it's very important to start looking at the strategies that you have and how those strategies are impacted by the various work activities and products that are taking place, and make sure that that gets refined as you go through. You might find that, hang on, some of the things that we're undertaking don't really align with our strategy. Is it because the strategies that we have aren't really up to date with what our organization is trying to achieve? You can have that conversation with more senior strategic advisors in the community. But ultimately, it's very important to bring that into the roadmap.
That's great, Grant. Thank you. A question from Murali. He says, how do you cost justify EA? He says, selling EA to sponsors. As Zuckerman once said, one cannot cost justify architecture. Yeah,
perfect question. So architecture for architecture's sake is completely invaluable. It's an academic activity, and ultimately for architecture to have value, it needs to be used outside of the architecture team. So one of the first things you need to do when you're setting up enterprise architecture is to identify the stakeholders that are going to get value out of what you're doing, and look at what it is that they're going to need from you, and build your enterprise architecture around addressing that. So oftentimes you'll look at the classic content meta model pictures and things like that. You look at TOGAF and you'll think, well, that's the methodology that I should be following, and so let me go about building all these different things. But the very first thing that TOGAF does talk about is strategy and stakeholder analysis, so everything does need to revolve around that. And it's important that you build just the elements that are going to address the business needs that you have. So if your initial stakeholders are in a certain department and they're interested in the enterprise architecture because it might be involved in updating IT technology that we have, then focus on those layers of the architecture, and focus on other things like data modeling and information modeling later on when there might be a need for those things. Ultimately, architecture is a very iterative approach, so it's important that you do short spins and short cycles so that you can build up value quickly and justify the existence of enterprise architecture in a short period of time.
That's perfect, Grant. Thank you. Question from Ray. He says, how do you measure value? How to measure risk?
A very good question. So value is something that can be measured in different ways. We alluded to some of those today. So value might be in terms of total cost of ownership. Cost is always the obvious one. But it might also be in terms of risk, and you might be looking at technical debt and things like that. You might also measure value in terms of our ability to satisfy customers. So that might be in the performance of our capabilities or the performance or reliability, I should say, of our capabilities as well. So these are things that can all be measured. And when you're measuring them, you can look at tools that might have built-in capabilities for running algorithms around those things, or you might build your own. You might look at total cost of ownership, for example. That might involve the cost of not just one component, but many other attached components. So you can start to calculate those things together and extrapolate over a period of time to factor in the life cycle of those components. So there's many different things that can be measured for value, and it's important to look at what things will be of value to different audiences. In some organizations, money isn't as much of a concern as others, so obviously look at what the big concerns are and how you can address those to produce value. Now, when you look at measuring risk, the important thing is firstly to model risk and make sure you capture what the risks are. A lot of the different frameworks out there today do in fact have areas for that. And when you look at risk, you can then measure it by attaching it to the areas where the risk is involved. So risk might, for example, have certain risk might be involved with a lot of different applications that we have. And so that's going to increase the criticality of that risk. Whereas a risk that involves only one application, which may be an application of low business value, that's a risk that we might be more willing to tolerate and is going to have a lower risk score.
Thank you, Grant. Question here from Philip. Do life cycles influence or augment the models? He says, in other words, if something ends, do the dependencies automatically end as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it really depends on how you model things. So personally, I have modeled things like that a lot, and it depends on the tool set and whether it supports that. So that's something obviously that ABACUS does. And so we like to look at chain reactions and flow-on effects and understand how things update. But you don't always want to build that into certain models. It depends. Sometimes you just want to be able to identify that there's a gap. You might, for example, be implementing a replacement solution, and you want to see that, well, hang on, we've replaced this application already, but we're not going to retire it for another 5 years. So why are we hanging on to this application when something that already does the job better and more efficiently has been put in place? So it depends on the kind of analysis. Both are useful, but ultimately, when you do get to the furthest maturity state of building roadmaps, I think it is important to be able to have those dependencies automatically recalculate as you make changes.
That's great. A question from Benson. He's asking, for a 200 plus applications, or for 200 plus applications, how long does it take to complete a roadmap in your experience, Grant?
Yeah, it really depends once again. So firstly, 200 applications in terms of very large organizations, it's not huge. So a lot of organizations will see 200 applications as being relatively small. Others will see it as a lot. But I would still, regardless, break it down as much as possible. So I would look at building roadmaps for different verticals first, potentially. Look at the departments that are involved with certain applications and which ones want to find out information first or which ones need the most help. So break it down and do little bits first. Ultimately, you should be looking at producing value with road mapping, I believe, within 3 months. And so I think 200 applications probably isn't doable in 3 months in most organizations. It does depend on how many people are involved in building out your architecture and building out the roadmaps, but it is a short time frame for that quantity. So you want to build out something quicker within 3 months, but ultimately 200 is something that could be achieved probably, I'd say, typically within about a year.
Excellent. I think this is quite a good follow-up question. So this is from Bob, and he's basically asking, how will the effort be managed and who will actually lead or manage it?
Yep, very good. So in terms of who manages things, I see road mapping activities as the responsibility of the enterprise architecture team. That differs in organizations, of course, but typically that's the case. Who actually does it? It becomes a team effort. So I think that the enterprise architect is responsible for overseeing it, and making sure all the bits and pieces that are needed to support it are produced along the way. But ultimately, it shouldn't be a solo effort. You need to look at essentially outsourcing as much of the data gathering that's needed. You can do that using things like SharePoint and maybe even just sending around Excel spreadsheets to people who might be able to complete them for you, and you can import that back into your repository. Ultimately, things will be consumed by other stakeholders, but it is the enterprise architect's responsibility in most cases to make sure that things happen and do get completed in a relatively short period of time.
Excellent. A question from John, and this is a very commonly asked question, so I'll be interested in your take on it, Grant. He says, "Hi, what would you say are the KPIs for an EA practice?"
Yeah, that's a great question, and it does come up a lot. I talked about some of those things in terms of road mapping, and those apply to EA practice in general. So firstly, non-functional kinds of things like reliability, availability, flexibility, things like that. Now, how you measure those will depend on your organization. So some of the things are more obvious than others. Things like cost typically are measured the same in all organizations with very few differences. But things like you might look at business fit and application technical fit and things like that as other scores, and those do differ a lot from organization to organization. So you might weight in different factors to that differently. Ultimately, we do have a roadmap white paper, and I do think that that does include a number of different KPIs. You can look at it in more detail. But yes, cost, performance, reliability, openness, risk, performance, and so forth. There's lots of different things that can be measured.
Thank you, Grant. This is an interesting question, I think. The question is, he says, can you please explain, if possibly, how roadmap can have viewpoints based on stakeholders? Yeah,
excellent. That's a really good question. So ultimately, all roadmaps should have stakeholders tied to them. So when you look at your roadmap analysis, or your stakeholder analysis, I should say, and think about the kinds of artifacts you want to produce, you should think about the kinds of roadmaps that they'll want to see when they get into needing to understand a certain road mapping activities. So it does depend on the stakeholder as to which view you'll produce. I mentioned the Gantt chart's kind of the classic view. Most people understand Gantt charts, so all stakeholders will typically like to see those and understand them. But often where things differ is where they want to drill down from there. So if they want to look at a particular activity within their Gantt chart, then they might want to see that from the perspective of, well, what are the impacts versus, well, what are the cost implications? So if you're looking at a KPI that you've measured from road mapping, then that's something that will be produced typically with some kind of chart, be it a pie chart or a bar chart, whereas something that's more structural involves attachments and so forth, that's going to involve more your box and line style diagram and maybe interactive views where you can drill down levels and see how things get decomposed.
Excellent. We're getting close to our end of our time, but we've got time for a couple of more questions, I think. Donovan asks, how do you see the planning differences between program management plans and EA roadmaps?
Yeah, very good. So those are really at different levels of granularity, and most organizations do have a pretty good handle on project planning. Ultimately, project planning is more tied closely to the solution space. I see the solution space or solution architecture being a subset of enterprise architecture. And so the solution space is more tactically driven. It's about how do we get a certain thing done, whereas enterprise architecture needs to be more strategically focused. So we're looking at all the different projects that are taking place, and we need to understand the impacts between them and ultimately make recommendations and changes based on that. So we might recommend that certain projects get put on hold until other ones are completed and so forth. So a lot of what happens in the solution space on the project management front should be fed into your enterprise architecture repository, but then it needs to be factored into a whole lot of other things that you've modeled to understand how strategy can be shaped and how you can make strategic changes over time.
Excellent. I think the last question here, I think Cecile, so is ABACUS integrated with I think ArchiMate, and it says is refactoring possible with ABACUS?
Yeah, good question. So we do have a lot of people come to us who've been using Archie before. Obviously, it's the free tool, so it's a nice place to start if you don't have anything else. But with ABACUS, we support the ArchiMate interchange standard, as does Archie. So you can save any model you have in Archie to the ArchiMate interchange standard. You can then open that as a new model in ABACUS, or you can import it into an existing model. So it's very easy to bring your artifacts from Archie over to ABACUS.
That's brilliant, Grant. Look, we've reached our end time. Grant, I'd really like to thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Grant, have you got any final words before I end today's presentation?
No, Simon, just a big thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you as well, Simon, for helping to chair the session. It's been really great for everyone to come along. So if you have any further questions, feel free to email me. Let me just pop up my email address quickly. And so it's grant.quick@avolutionsoftware.com. We do also have a road mapping white paper, which can be downloaded from our website in the collateral section. If you are interested in ABACUS, we do offer 30-day trials of that through our website as well. So just get in touch if there's anything we can help with. But otherwise, thanks for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
That's brilliant, Grant. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you everyone for your time and joining us today. And please join us again for another Open Group webinar in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Simon.